Hi folks, so today we're going to review Dragonflight by Anne McCaffrey, which is the first of about a zillion Dragon Riders of Pern books that she's written over the decades. So this is the one that started the ball rolling back in 1968, although I gather that there were 2 or 3 parts of this were published as novellas the previous year or two, and I think I'm right in saying that one of them won a Hugo for a novella. So the first section of this book follows Lessa. She's the daughter of a family that's been wiped out in a sort of coup. One of the neighbouring princelings has sort of taken over their patch, plus a few others as well, to make a sort of bigger kingdom for himself. So she's the last surviving daughter of the family at Ruatha Hold, and she's busy fighting a sort of single-handed, low-intensity guerrilla war against the usurper Fax, he's called. Fax is kind of a kind of standard issue arsehole kind of prince who's taken over, waded in with his size 12 hobnail boots on and generally made a nuisance of himself. And she is doing her best to sabotage all of the workings of the castle and the surrounding territory, so that it's not profitable for him. That's the objective, is to kind of run it down to the point where nothing's really working very well and no food doesn't really generate much in the way of good quality food, and that he doesn't like going there because every time he goes there he gets ill because the food's not good or whatever. Anyway, so she's doing that, and quite effectively too. So whilst all of that's happening, the dragon riders, they of the dragons, are busy looking for somebody to be the next so-called weir woman, who's effectively going to be bonded to the next dragon queen, who's shortly going to hatch. And this is something they have to do every time there's a dragon going to be hatched out. And they've got a hunch that there might be a suitable candidate at Ruatha Hold, and that they think that because they're aware that there's been this sort of something's going on in that location, and they've got a hunch that someone's behind it, and also because that family has been a source of previous weir women, so their sort of force is strong in these ones. So we're also told pretty early on that the dragon riders are currently going through a bit of a low spell. They're kind of a throwback to the past, a quirk of history almost. Most of the ruling families, if not the people and some of the harpists who keep the kind of lore alive, now kind of dismiss them as an irrelevance, or a myth even at best. We come to learn that the planet goes through cycles of 200 years, where another planet in the same solar system kind of comes close in their sort of orbit to Pern, close enough that it can throw out these tendrils called threads with a capital T, which can reach across to Pern, and when they fall through the atmosphere can cause all sorts of harm. So that happens once every couple of hundred years, and the cycle of the threads lasts for anything up to 50 years. The problem for the dragon riders in this book is that the last time around, for whatever reason, the red planet didn't come close enough to Pern for the thread thing to happen. So it's now been nearly 400 years since the last time around, and that's a long time in a sort of fairly agricultural, sort of middle-aged sort of era society to remember that stuff. So there's not much in the way of a written record. It's just passed down in the form of songs and tales and legends. And 400 years is a long time. So they've, as I say, become a bit of a throwback or a quirk of history. So they go to Ruatha. There's a bit of a to-do with the arsehole prince Fax and one of the dragon riders, and Lessa is duly selected to go be the trainee weir woman, W-E-Y-R woman, weir woman, who will bond ultimately with the new queen dragon who's about to hatch. So the middle act of the book follows Lessa as she bonds with the new queen, and then her subsequent training as a dragon rider and all-round sort of bestie with the new queen dragon. And then the final act is the dragon riders, who are sort of depleted in number, see above. Their numbers have dwindled over the previous 400 years. So the final act is the dragon riders up against it, fighting the start of the next wave of threads threat attacks on the planet and how they do that and what have you. So I was skeptical going into this book, and I was skeptical because I wasn't sure if it was fantasy really, or if it was science fiction, or is it a Mills and Boon sort of bodice ripper dressed up as a science fiction book, because it has a bit of a reputation as a bit of a almost like a romance novel, which to be fair I didn't really find as I was reading it. There's definitely a strong whiff of fantasy. There's quite a few kind of very typical fantasy tropes at play here. There's the hidden child with destiny or special powers. There's the long forgotten lore to rediscover, ancient scrolls to consult, old songs to revive, and there are castles, princes, arrogant and effective leaders, and of course the complacency about the impending predicted thread cycle, which is effectively a sort of scoffed at prophecy, which is another classic fantasy trope. Plus, of course, there are freaking dragons, which is pretty hardcore fantasy, if ever I've heard it. So definitely a strong whiff of fantasy so far. But wait a minute, because there is also orbital mechanics, and there's an interesting confluence of planets. There's a sound kind of sciencey explanation of the nature of the threads and the way that they do the harm that they do. And there are hints, as I said, of Earth's colonization of Pern in the dim and distant past. So presumably there were at one point spaceships and a colony. And the fallen colony trope is a classic science fiction. So they've regressed over many thousands of years to a simpler life just because of the degradation of technology and equipment and the inability to remanufacture it and so on over time. Plus the privations of dealing with an alien landscape and biosphere and so on. There's also teleportation of sorts. The dragons and their riders can traverse great distances on Pern pretty much, instantaneously. I suppose you could argue that that's really just like dragon magic, and so perhaps this one's a kind of a wash either way. Maybe it's 50-50 science fiction and fantasy. Somewhat to my surprise, though, there's also time travel and the associated loops and potential for paradox that goes with that. Another classic science fiction plot device. So there is more science fiction to it than I might have expected. And McCaffrey herself is insistent that she be considered a science fiction author, or she was when she was alive, rather than fantasy. So perhaps we ought to allow her the casting vote. So Dragonflight did remind me somewhat of Robin Hobbs's books. The writing is engaging, the characters are strong, and the plot moves along at a pretty brisk pace without demanding too much of me as the reader. I'm still not convinced I want 20 of them on my shelves, more than 20 in fact, and there are many more than that in the series. But I am prepared to I enjoyed it enough to give the other two in the original trilogy a go, and see if they can, between them, justify the shelf space that's currently being occupied by all these McCaffrey books. So, to sort of summarise then, I enjoyed it more than I thought I would, honestly, and I didn't read it in one sitting, but it wasn't far off, and it was a page-turner, and I would give it a pretty solid 7 out of 10, I think, somewhat to my surprise. So I shall read the other two at some point, and we'll report back. But until next time, bye for now.